and welcome to another edition of In a Matter of Minutes. My name is John Jones, the Advisor Marketing Services Director here at USA Financial. And today, in a matter of minutes, I'm joined by Steve Liverance, also from USA Financial, our Chief Human Capital Officer, also known as the HR guy. And today we're talking about HR principles within a financial advisor practice. One of the things that we help with is a lot of that HR structuring, from the onboarding to the performance management in the middle, and then the offboarding and all the different parts and pieces and steps in between. So thanks so much, Steve, for joining me today. I'm excited for our conversation.
Absolutely, good.
So let's jump right in and talk about sort of the three phases of employment management. So there's the onboarding side. You're doing the, I have this need and I need to bring someone on. Let's talk a little bit about that, and we'll reference back to a podcast series that Steve did with Mark Mersman several months ago that goes really in depth on this. But today we want to really bring awareness to that series and talk a high-level overview of what's included in some of that.
Sure. So the podcast that you mentioned, there's a series of them, and obviously they're much more detailed than what I'll be able to cover today. But they're meant to assist our advisor practices with some of the most prevalent or areas within HR that they may need to explore frequently. And I have a lot of advisor offices that contact me to talk through from an HR perspective to get advice on how to implement best practices. And a lot of times they're also looking for feedback in regards to level of risk.
Sure.
So there is a lot of risk associated with hiring, or from that matter, performance management, or from that matter, the offboarding of an individual from your organization. And outside of, or I guess within the service industry, I'll use a cliche: people are the greatest asset of the organization. And I know that gets overused, but it is true. So making investments from an HR perspective to make sure that you have folks engaged, that they're motivated, and that you have the right benefits and incentives in place is super important.
Sure.
But also it's important from the aspect from an HR side is that you are protecting yourself, or at least going into the HR strategies that you have in place, knowing what your risk is.
Sure.
Because you can have a very safe process that lowers the risk, or you can implement processes that introduce quite a bit of risk or liability for the organization.
Sure. And a lot of that, just like when financial professionals are meeting with their clients, documenting conversations, documenting what's going on. And a lot of that has a similarity or a parallel in the human resources HR world, where it's a lot of documentation, acknowledgments, and things of that nature, right?
Yeah, documentation is probably the most important piece from making sure that you're protecting yourself from liability, just to document what has occurred.
Sure.
And then the second piece of that, John, which probably does not vary much from running a practice, financial advising practice, is the consistency, making sure that you are applying it consistently as much as possible. There's always going to be nuances, but consistent approach.
Yeah, and a lot of that documentation we actually help with and provide in terms of resources out, and we've referenced the podcast series a couple of times. It's available in the USA Financial dashboard on the left-hand side in coaching and consulting. There's a human resources section there, and there are a number of different documents as we're talking about documenting different things, from employee manuals to formatting of different types of things. So talk a little bit about some of the pieces that are available out there.
Sure. So in addition to the podcast, which we talk through from a hiring, performance management, and an offboarding perspective, and then we also touch on another area that has some higher liability attached to it and is very prevalent in today's environment.
Certainly.
Revolving around discrimination or harassment, and making sure that you're creating a positive, safe environment for folks from an employment perspective. So the documents that actually correspond with that are things like making our performance management or performance review tool available to the advisors that we work with so that they can use that as a starting point, and they can use it in its actual form, or they can use it as a place to start and modify to create their own.
Sure.
Our employee manual, which obviously is very important regardless of the size of your business, to have a manual in place for employees so that the policies are laid out, expectations on from an employer perspective are set out so that the employee knows. But we also have the non-compete or our non-compete and our non-solicitation incorporated right into that employee manual. So advisors can utilize those as beginning templates, so to speak, or places to start as well. And we have a lot of other templates in there too related to offer letters, interview questions, how to, when you're hiring, getting started, where do you go from a job board perspective? Which ones are successful? How should you set yourself up?
Right. And one of the things that I think might be going through the mind of, a business owner, financial advisors, financial professionals included is, I only have, Shirley or Joey, who's, I just have one person. And this is as important if you have one person as it is if you have 100, right? Because it's that individual from a process management, from a consistency of engagement and professional development is just because it's one person, working for you, that person has a desire to have a process in place, and it makes the employee, and it helps you as well, but it makes an employee feel more comfortable that there's a process in place, that there's a formalized method for review and feedback and all that, right?
Absolutely, John. So my role primarily is to run the HR function or lead the HR function for USA Financial. And there's a large enough employee base that it's becomes more and more important the larger you get, but it is not diminished completely, and is still very important, as you indicated, regardless of the size of the organization. And many of the advisor offices that we work with don't have the number of employees that USA Financial does, but still important that they have good practices in place, that they have strategies set. If you take good care of your employees, they will take good care of your clients. It just makes sense for you to make investment there and to have good strategies from personal development to making sure your employees are engaged. And then the strategy also needs to make sure that regardless of your size of your organization, that you understand the risks associated or liability associated with the strategies that you have in place. And so you're consciously deciding as you apply the federal and state guidelines for employment that you are making a conscious decision about the level of risk as an organization you're willing to take and what fits your group or your organization as well.
Certainly. And you talked about the federal versus state guidelines. There are certain parts, and one of the offerings that we make available is your time and expertise, given your HR background, to the financial advisor offices. But there are certain things where, we're in Michigan, so we know certain things that, are applicable to Michigan or federally. But then there are certain, very specific instances or state to state things that change, where we would then need to refer out to an HR resource, whether that's an employment attorney or other HR service more locally, and that can provide a higher level of expertise there.
Correct. So when I'm working with an advisor or their office in regards to HR related questions, if it's about HR process or performance management, or I would say even some pieces of onboarding or offboarding are very consistent, and there's there's federal guidelines that obviously govern the entire U.S. So most of it is actually driven at the federal level, but there are individual state, and in fact, John, it goes to county sometimes. There's even legislation that's in place for cities. So New York City has some of their own requirements that you need to be able to operate within. So when working with an office, typically we'll talk through the federal piece, but as we get to the state level, I can usually give them some level of support, but specifically we'll always refer them to an employment attorney, or like you had mentioned, some other type of HR service that would be able to help them determine what specifically do they need to be aware of in their state or their location.
Excellent. Well, as we like to keep these in a matter of minutes, any last parting shots?
I will just say this, that from a HR perspective, I mentioned earlier that some of the offices that I work with despise HR. It's not part of their core business, as they'll phrase it.
Sure.
Or they just don't feel like they have the skill set to be successful or qualified to make the right decisions there. And in working with those advisor offices, we laugh and we joke about, yeah, it's not the funnest stuff sometimes, but it is super important and can be super rewarding and can truly help advisor practices grow when they take the time and make those investments. So what might not be your favorite subject or topic, it is definitely an important one and one that you need to invest in.
And just like financial advisors recommend that you should work with a professional, there are professionals. You don't have to be the expert yourself. You can find that HR professional, whether that's leaning on our resources, actually working with an agency or resource that specifically, in other words, outsourcing your HR side, whether that's payroll and benefits and all of that, where you can be advised and make the decisions, but you have those people that are using their vast knowledge and expertise to do that. So. And speaking of that, Steve, I appreciate your vast knowledge and expertise being shared today in our segment. So again, you've taken the time to watch this segment. So go out to the dashboard, take a look at those podcasts that were put together, review some of those resources. After you've done that, feel free to reach out to Steve. Thank you again, Steve, and make the minutes matter.